Human beings are difficult to gauge when it comes to their reasons for voting and supporting specific candidates. More important, the time frames involved in elections are a moving target, especially when it comes to parliamentary elections, as those are predicated upon the ruling party's ability to maintain a functioning majority. If they can't either control their members or maintain their coalition, they will be forced to call elections and dissolve the government. In the United States, a ruling president can still be president long after he has lost the ability to influence the legislative process and agenda. This happens so frequently that we have a name for it: lame duck president. Normally, this refers to the last 2 years of almost every presidency that has gone for 2 consecutive terms. It can also refer to when a president. Government change. 187. Loses both houses of Congress at the midpoint of his term. The broader point to take away is that we watch the opinion polls in the United States for elections, but we have a set time to do this for, as the elections are every 4 years for the president and then every 2 years for the midterms. This is a much different animal than a parliament that can change should the ruling party lose a vote on a key piece of legislation like a budget or defense policy. How does this loss of control happen? This has as many permutations as there are prejudices on what voters consider their hot-button topics. The usual list of suspects contains the economy, poor management of budgets, war, and scandals. To some extent, all of these can get bound up in what I like to call my political rule of 12. Once a party has ruled for over 12 years, it generally starts losing its grip on the majority and eventually loses the government to the opposition. This happened with the 2006 U.S. midterm elections with Republican control of the U.S. House, it happened with the 2006 Swedish elections, and it happened with the 2006 Canadian elections. The rule of 12 is a simple time gauge of knowing that after 12 years, the party in power has done enough bad things to upset the voters and warrant the mood of, throw the bums out. For trading, what we learn is that there are opportunities that arise from understanding the overall direction of why the government is changing and understanding the time frames involved. If a government is changing because of a desire by the voters to bring change to policy that is positive, like cutting taxes or reducing government spending on social welfare to boost the economy, then this is going to be anticipated as a positive move and the markets will generally like the idea. Investors will react favorably to this perceived change and buy equities in the currency of the nation in advance of the actual election taking place. This is precisely what happened in Germany. If the party that wants to do this then loses its leader, shows that party leaders are incompetent or that they will not win an outright majority, thus necessitating that their policies will get watered down, then this expectation of a favorable event is taken away and investors sell their holdings. However, if the government is changing because of bad behaviors like scandal or a prolonged war, then the markets will not necessarily have a clear direction to go and the expectations will merely be positive to get rid of the incumbents, but not much more. Let's take a look at these in the next chapter. Chapter 11. Government. Scandals. The United States has a varied history of scandals, which makes it difficult to narrow the list down as there are so many worthy examples of skullduggery and bad behavior. The more outrageous scandals seem to correlate strongly with the smaller offices and backwaters where there is less oversight of the officeholder's activity. In other words, mold doesn't grow where there's sunlight. Local officials seem to have special proclivity for using influence and muscle to get what they want. The graft, corruption, sex scandals are more numerous at the local level, but not as important for shifting power for a broader group. The continuum looks like this. Numerous frequent scandals on the left side with small impact geographically to less numerous frequent with large impact geographically on the right side as we move from local to state to federal government. Remember, scandals don't always mean that the people involved get booted out of office. However, those government officials usually lose their respect and power. Growing up in the Chicago area, I've been exposed to more political scandals than I can ever put down in one chapter. There's a nice range of gubernatorial misdeeds to choose from, with one governor getting caught taking bribes from racetrack owners just to get additional highway exits to their tracks, to a recent governor being involved in the sale of government licenses and contracts while he was Secretary of State. Then there was a Secretary of State who died and they found shoeboxes full of cash in his closet. There are so many aldermanic examples that it is impossible to choose, but just think about the nicknames like Bathhouse John or Hinky Dink and you get the idea. The best way to sum up the Chicago experience. 189. 190. Politics. Comes from Al Capone as he was encouraging people to go to the polls, vote early and often. It has been our motto ever since. It's with this in mind that we begin our investigation of the impacts that scandals have had on governments and the reactions in the financial markets to these contretemps. The events we review are major scandals, although they may have started with seemingly minor offenses. 2000 U.S. presidential election. Like so much of politics, the origins of the outcome of the 2000 presidential election started several years earlier. U.S. President Bill Clinton had been plagued throughout his presidency by accusations of sexual harassment, but on January 17, 1998, things got crazy. A story broke that U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno had granted independent counsel Kenneth Starr the authority to investigate Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Clinton denied that he had had an affair with Lewinsky. He denied it to his wife, to his Democratic colleagues, and to the American people. On January 26, I watched Clinton turn red-faced on national television when he stated, "I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." By August 17, Clinton had a different approach as he apologized to the nation for his inappropriate relationship with Ms. Lewinsky. The president wasn't the only one having problems in 1998. The U.S. midterm elections didn't go as planned for the Republicans, as they had anticipated a significant addition to their majority in the aftermath of the Clinton-Lewinsky situation. Unfortunately, the Republicans made history, the wrong kind of history. For the first time since 1822, the party not in control of the White House, Republicans, had failed to gain seats in the midterm election of a president's second term. That's pretty ugly. It cost U.S. Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich the support of his party and his job as Speaker. It didn't help that Gingrich was the first House Speaker to be sanctioned for ethics violations and had to pay a fine of $300,000. However, the Republicans in the House didn't have to turn over the reins until January. This meant they could proceed with the impeachment hearings that they had approved on October 8. During the lame duck session of Congress, they tried Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice that emanated from Starr's investigation of Clinton's relationship with Monica Lewinsky. By definition, this scandal hits on all cylinders, as you have a barely legal White House intern, the president, sex, and lies all in the same sentence. Perhaps we should have seen something like this coming when Clinton's 1996 campaign strategist, Dick Morris, resigned after. Government scandals. 191. Reports surfaced about his relationship with a prostitute came out during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. House Republicans ultimately impeached Bill Clinton on December 19, 1998. They did this with the knowledge that it was highly unlikely that the U.S. Senate would convict him of the charges. On February 12, by a vote of 55 inches not guilty to 45 inches guilty, in the Senate, Clinton missed the ignominy of being tossed out of the White House for lying about an extramarital affair. Nevertheless, the event served its purpose for the Republicans. The ensuing election. William Jefferson Clinton was a very popular president, and his vice president absorbed some of that popularity from Clinton's coattails. This made Al Gore a formidable candidate for the 2000 presidential elections. However, the impeachment forever stained both men in the eyes of American voters. That scandal prevented Gore from using Clinton extensively in the campaign. Without the scandal, Gore could have run on the theme of 4 more years of economic good times and prosperity and might have handily won. Due to the scandal, though, morality was the central theme of the 2000 election. Gore chose to run on a theme of a new morality and distanced himself from Clinton. But problems at a Democratic fundraiser at a California Buddhist temple for Clinton's 1996 presidential campaign sabotaged this message. This was where Gore raised funds during a luncheon at the Shilai Temple. The fundraiser luncheon was attended by Gore and was organized by Democratic National Committee fundraisers John Wong and Maria Shaw. According to U.S. law at the time, it was illegal for religious organizations to donate money to politicians or political groups due to their tax-free status. Gore denied any wrongdoing, but his no-controlling legal position gave the appearance of using a technicality to get away with it. To shore up his theme and image, Gore picked Joe Lieberman to be his running mate. Senator Lieberman was one of the first members of the Democratic Party to denounce Clinton's affair with Lewinsky and was seen as a straight shooter. He was also the first Jewish American to run on a major presidential ticket. The Republicans ran George W. Bush, son of former President George H. W. Bush. Bush was not as polished as Gore or Lieberman, but his folksy way of talking and his ability to make fun of himself endeared him to the American people. Bush's approach was direct and his language was blunt. This especially hit home with voters who felt they were duped by Clinton on the Lewinsky scandal. The Republican themes were stronger national security, immigration reform, and cutting taxes. Shoring up his weak conservative and national credentials, Bush chose as his running mate Dick. 192. Politics. Cheney, who had been a defense secretary in the first Bush administration and chief of staff in the Ford administration. On November 7, the nation went to the polls and voted. On November 8, the nation still didn't know who would be the next president. The race was tight, very tight, and it came down to 3 states that still were too close to call: New Mexico, Oregon, and Florida. Due to Florida's large population and therefore the large number of electoral votes it garnered, a candidate winning Florida would win the election. Recount, here we come. Market reaction. So what did all this upheaval mean for the financial markets? Let's first consider what Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve had been up to during this time. The Fed had pump-primed the U.S. financial system leading up to the Y2K panic and had gradually begun to take it away. Figure 11.1 shows that the Fed had started to raise rates in July 1999 from 4.75% to 6.50% in May 2000. The pattern underscored the political acuity of the Greenspan Fed policymakers, as they were raising rates at a rate of 25 basis points until May 2000 and then did 50 basis points. They then went on. Figure 11.1 U.S. Federal Funds Rate. Source: used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Government Scandals. 193. Figure 11.2 U.S. Generic 10-year government bond source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Hold until after January. They did this to finish their monetary tightening as far in advance of the election as possible to avoid any possibility of being seen as favoring one side over the other. Whenever the Fed drains liquidity from the system, the markets are affected in several ways. In this case, the Fed acted aggressively to boost rates and had signaled to the markets that it was done. For bonds, figure 11.2, this was a favorable situation and they proceeded to rally up to the election as the market liked the Fed aggressively fighting inflation, but the market also liked the Fed signaling that it was done. As we have seen, the Fed raising interest rates raises the cost of money, squeezes out inflation, and acts as a dampener on economic activity and therefore earnings. For stocks, figure 11.3, this was not a good thing and they went sideways leading up to the election. For the US dollar, figure 11.4, this was a good thing and it rallied in the lead up to the election. Bush held a small lead in the voter opinion surveys for most of the fall, but as the voting date drew near, most surveys fell within the statistical sampling error and were too close to call. The outcome of the election would be anticipated unknown. But the markets couldn't anticipate that the election would be won not in the election booth, but in the nation's highest court. 194. Politics. Figure 11.3 Dow Jones Industrial Average source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Figure 11.4 U.S. Dollar Index. Source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Government Scandals. 195. Gore wins. The popular vote. This was the first time since 1888 that a candidate who received the most popular actual votes lost the election. Gore, Lieberman garnered 50,999,897 votes versus the 50,456,002 votes that Bush-Cheney received. This is the unusual case where it didn't look like every vote counted, but it did, in Florida. On November 8, Florida began a manual recount at the prompting of the Gore campaign, which sued to get several Florida counties going on a recount, but not all Florida counties. On November 12, the Bush campaign made its court appearance to get the hand count stopped. This went back and forth in the state courts, then made it to the Florida Supreme Court, and finally to the U.S. Supreme Court. The nation's highest court ruled in favor of Bush to stop the recounts and allow the certified Florida election result to stand, that Bush won the state by 536 votes. Alt-out her is a popular vote for individual candidates on the ballots. What actually happens is the election of presidential electors, who in turn cast the official electoral votes for president and vice president. In other words, the United States has an indirect system. The presidential electors are allocated to each state according to the number of federal senators and representatives they have in Congress. By definition, it means that the states with the largest populations get the most electoral votes. This is why candidates spend most of their time and money in these estates. It is a winner-take-all system by which if you win the state by one vote, you still get all of the electoral votes. On November 8, there were 3 states that were undecided: Florida, New Mexico, and Oregon. Bush had 246 electoral votes and Gore had 254. New Mexico had only 5 electoral votes and Oregon only 7, so neither would decide the election. Florida had 25 electoral votes, and therefore whoever won Florida won the election with a total over 270. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bush by a 5-4 decision, the slimmest of margins. This left open the question of whether the Gore campaign would continue to fight the ruling and prolong the process. From November 8 until early December, the markets had to price in a risk premium that this election would continue to be fought in the Florida courts or even the U.S. Supreme Court. This could have led to demonstrations, akin to what has happened recently in Mexico. It also could have led to bloodshed and riots, like what happened during the 1960s. What did happen was the Dow Industrials dropped almost 700 points from the election to the end of the month. When things are uncertain, investors tend to go to safe haven plays or at the minimum cut back on their equity exposures. This activity certainly means they buy the safest security out there, and that's U.S. Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. The yield on the generic U.S. 10-year note dropped almost 50 basis points from the election. 196. Politics. To the end of the month, the U.S. dollar behaved erratically as it initially rallied with the election of a Republican and then tanked with the drop in the yields in the U.S. bond market. Essentially, we got 2 out of 3 instruments to move in the fashion that we thought would happen given the uncertainty principle and the recent end to the tightening cycle by the U.S. Federal Reserve. In a historic show of statesmanship, Al Gore conceded the election to Bush the day after the U.S. Supreme Court decision on December 13. At the very next Federal Reserve meeting, Alan Greenspan and company cut interest rates in early January by 50 basis points, essentially taking back the rate hike they had done in May. It was like the Fed was waiting to give the next president a gift to get started on his new job. The Fed would continue this gifting by eventually cutting rates some 250 basis points by June. The nation would need all of it by September. Last, I realize that many will be saying the real scandal to the election was related to George Bush's brother Jeb being the governor of Florida and that there was skullduggery involved in voting due to this. There was the U.S. Supreme Court connection with more conservative judges voting for the end of the recount. Then there were all the legal shenanigans and public relations involved in Florida. Studies after the elections showed various outcomes depending on how broad or how narrow were the standards used to determine voter intent. Yes, the hanging Chad syndrome. One study showed that if the recount had persisted in the counties where the Gore campaign had sued for the count to be challenged, Bush would have won with a narrow majority. However, if the entire state had been done along with a broad standard, then Gore would have won. This is one of the mistakes that the Gore campaign made that I still don't understand. Why didn't they ask for the entire state? I think the biggest mistake that Gore made, though, was not getting third-party candidate Ralph Nader on his side. Nader drew 97,488 votes in Florida and effectively cost Gore the election, as most of those votes would likely have gone to Gore. 2006 Canadian federal elections. The U.S. neighbor to the north is a nation that became sovereign only in 1982. It is a political hybrid. The system is a representative government that has a combination of a constitutional monarchy and a federal structure. It is similar to the British parliamentary system and the Titus bicameral. The House of Commons is in charge of running the day-to-day issues of the government and formulates legislation. The members are elected by a popular vote. The members of the Senate are appointed for life by the incumbent prime. Government scandals. 197. Minister. The Senate has veto power over constitutional change and reserves itself the role of reconciling legal inconsistencies in House of Commons legislation. The smaller provinces and states were originally supposed to be protected by the Senate. The executive side of the government is generally formed by the political party that is the majority in the House of Commons. The leader of this party becomes the Prime Minister and is elected by this party to that role. The party that forms the government doesn't always have to be in the majority, though. There are times when the elections split members in such a way that no majority can be formed without two parties linking up. In this case, the party with the largest number of seats can form the government as long as it can produce enough votes through its coalition of parties to pass major legislation like a budget. One of the major differences between the United States and Canada is that the party in power in Canada produces major pieces of legislation on its own without necessarily asking members of its party for input. It would be like the US president working up a bill and then presenting it for an up or down vote by Congress without the members of Congress working on it in committee. This is one of the reasons that this form of government can be unstable. Party members may end up voting for some legislation that may not be good for their riding or district. This also encourages members to leave and form third parties to get away from the one-size-fits-all type of legislation. This means that unless the majority party takes into consideration these interests, there will be more third parties and more instability that ultimately results in a failed government. On the flip side, it can mean that the people or voters don't have to suffer through lame duck presidents like we do in the United States. Sins from the past. The seeds of destruction of the party in power were sown in the 38th general election. They were evident on June 28, 2004, when the 39th general election resulted in a Liberal Party victory with a minority government. The average shelf life of a minority government in Canada is about 18 months. This coalition government of Prime Minister Paul Martin was particularly unstable, with four parties, Liberal Party, Conservative Party, New Democratic Party (NDP), and Bloc Québécois (ISBQ) involved. They shared too few common views on budget or legislative matters. There were threats of no-confidence votes to bring down the government almost from day one, the throne speech where the ruling party lays out its priorities for the coming legislative session. This Liberal minority government lasted until November 28, 2005, when a vote of no confidence passed. Why did this happen? But of course. 198. Politics. Scandal. Let's take a look at the explanation that Wikipedia gives for the famous Canadian body that was charged with investigating a potential kickback program by the majority Liberal Party. Wikipedia should be viewed like an old uncle who's very knowledgeable but sometimes doesn't remember all the facts. The Gomery Commission, formerly the Commission of Inquiry into the Sponsorship Program and Advertising Activities, was a federal Canadian commission headed by the retired Justice John Gomery for the purpose of investigating the sponsorship scandal, which involved allegations of corruption within the Canadian government. The commission was called by former Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin in February 2004 soon after a report by the Auditor General of Canada found unexplainable irregularities in the sponsorship program. The commission was part of Martin's active campaign to be seen as working to solve the problem. Note that the timing of the call for the commission was in February 2004 and there was an election held that year in June, meaning this was an issue that was unresolved and would dog the Liberals throughout their time at the helm. It also meant that the government would be unsettled easily whenever a major item of news on the inquiry leaked out or when there was a major piece of legislation brought up in the House. The government was always teetering on the edge. In April 2005, the Liberal Party encountered such a problem when it brought the budget up for a vote. Watch the progression of problems that were going on for the government from April 21 to April 27. From the Bush update. And speaking of out of control, how about Canada? Not sure when a vote of no confidence will happen and not sure whether the Liberal government will enact a budget or call for elections. Here's just a microcosm of why that's bad. Deals are being attempted to stay in power and that means everything is on that table. The latest is that Prime Minister Paul Martin's aide yesterday eyes open to changing the federal budget in an effort to in the support of the NPASH prepared for a private meeting with New Democratic Party leader Jack Layton, according to the Globe and Mail. Mr. Martin capped off a frenzied week of political maneuvering yesterday by praising Mr. Layton's attempt to get the budget through Parliament and see if we can make it work. I'm going to have discussions with Mr. Layton. I don't think I want to preclude any conclusion on those discussions, Mr. Martin said as he faced angry callers on CBC Radio's cross-country checkup. The NDP wants the Liberals to remove corporate tax cuts and replace them with increased social spending. Mr. Layton and Mr. Martin were scheduled to meet late last night. I think equity market. Government scandals. 199. Figure 11.5 US. Dollar versus Canadian dollar source. Used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Players who had factored in tax cuts for business in Canada are going to be reassessing and revising downward their expectations should such a deal with the NP happen. None of this is good for the currency. See figure 11.5 of the Canadian dollar versus the American dollar. By the way, in case you didn't know, the NDP is the Socialist Party in Canada. April 22. Okay, keep an eye on the developments in Canada as the politics continue to hurt the currency. Adding to the uncertainty, here's this headline in the Toronto Post. Canadians want to wait for Gomery report. A majority of Canadians support Prime Minister Martin's view that an election should not occur until after the Gomery inquiry into the sponsorship scandal releases its report in December, a new poll has found. It's bad enough that the government could fall at any time, now that time could appear to be put off until the end of the year. This is the last thing that the financial markets want, extended uncertainty over the resolution of the political mess. Contemplation. 200. Politics. Of dropping corporate tax cuts to appease would-be political partner is just one example of the slippery slope. April 27. The news out of the Canadian political morass is adding to the swamp-like feeling of the loonie. Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin inked a $4.6 billion deal with Socialist Party NDP's Jack Layton that is aimed at salvaging the federal budget yesterday, a move that will force the Conservatives' opposition party to rely on the separatist bloc Quebec OIS if the party wishes to bring down the government in the coming weeks, according to the Globe and Mail. In exchange for agreeing to the New Democratic Party's demands for more spending on the environment, social housing, foreign aid, and tuition reduction, the Liberals have secured a commitment of support on all no-confidence motions until the budget receives royal assent. Unfortunately, they haven't secured a government, as the deal doesn't mean Martin's party has the votes to defeat a no-confidence motion supported by the other two opposition parties. It only means they will get a budget void of tax cuts this year. I guess my first response is Mr. Martin and Mr. Layton think $4.6 billion worth of taxpayers' money is the price to make corruption go away, Conservative leader Stephen Harper said during a break from a late afternoon fundraiser. I wonder if the taxpayers of Canada are going to think the same thing, G&M. The financial markets aren't wondering at all, they are reducing exposure. The Canadian dollar was losing ground during this process, which began in March, figure 11.5. The US dollar strengthened against the Canadian dollar from a low of 1.20 in mid-March to a high of around 1.27 in mid-May. The generic 10-year Canadian bond rallied during this uncertainty, with yields dropping from around 4.50% down to around 3.80%, figure 11.6. The Toronto Stock Exchange sank over 500 points during the same time frame, figure 11.7. Eventually, the budget did pass and the Liberals staved off a government collapse. This occurred with the understanding that elections would be called after the Gomery Commission issued its report. Then the Gomery Commission did something really amusing. It held open meetings that were closed to the media. In other words, anyone could attend, but you just couldn't be reported on in the press. This meant that a little-known blogger in Minnesota could report the daily goings-on without much fear of legal reprisal. This also meant that most of the information from the testimony to the commission was out well before the commission made its first report. Government scandals. 201. Figure 11.6 Canadian generic 10-year government bond source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. Figure 11.7 Toronto Stock Exchange source, used with permission from Bloomberg LP. 202. Politics. The Change-No Change election. On November 1, 2005, Justice Gomery released his first phase report. Again, Wikipedia. Gomery criticized Jean Chrétien and his chief of staff Jean Pelletier but cleared them of direct involvement in kickback schemes. While people such as Alfonso Gagliano, Chuck Gattei, and Jacques Corriveau took advantage of the program, Gomery observed that such abuses would not have been possible had Chrétien not set the program up without safeguards in the first place. Gomery said that Pelletier failed to take the most elementary precautions against mismanagement, and Mr. Chrétien was responsible for him. Gomery also exonerated Prime Minister Paul Martin, the former Minister of Finance, during most of the sponsorship program. Gomery specifically said that Martin is entitled, like other ministers from the Quebec caucus, to be exonerated from any blame for carelessness or misconduct, as the Department of Finance's role was not oversight, but setting the fiscal framework. November 8, Bush update. Canadian NDP leader Jack Layton's aide his party will no longer prop up the Liberals because they won't support a crackdown on private health care. November 15 is the next time